Thank you so much, Trevor, and a very warm welcome to all of you to the second session of our three-part masterclass series on codes of ethics. To those of you who weren't able to join us for the first session, we have the recording available, and if you would like to access this, please do contact us, and I will be shortly showing you the email that you can use. To those of you who are joining for the first time, we say a very warm welcome and trust that you will find the session very useful. Just a reminder to those of you who've been able to attend each of the sessions in person, you will be eligible for a certificate of attendance, which we will provide after the January session. During November's masterclass session, we were delighted to launch the Portuguese version of the Code of Ethics Handbook, which is available on our website, which is coi.org.mz. So please do use this and the other resources available to you on our website for your important work in ethics. So to today's session. The session today builds very nicely on the first, where we introduced the Code of Ethics and contextualized it in its place in the organization and within the ethics management framework. And today we will focus on the process of designing and developing a code of ethics. So our program today looks like this. We will start with just a short recap of session 1 and the ethics management framework, and then look at keys to approaching how to develop this code of ethics. And our panelists, Fatima Ravat and Jovita Fazenda, will be providing that information. We'll take questions, and as Trevor said, if you could put your questions into the Q&A box, I'll be collating those during the discussions so that we can deal with them quite quickly before we go on to the next part of the program. In the second session, we will look at the actual work of drafting a code of ethics. And then in session 3, key elements in the design process. And we will take questions towards the end. And at the end of the session, we will have, as we did the last time, an evaluation. If you do need to contact us, please do contact us on COI, sorry, I thought I had it here, COI.org.mz, or on the Gmail address, coimozambique@gmail.com. So we will finish the masterclass series on the 21st of January, also between 11 and 12:30, where we will introduce you to the ins and outs of implementing the Code of Ethics in your organization. And without further ado, I'm very, very pleased to welcome our masterclass experts, Jovita Fazenda of MultiChoice Mozambique and Fatima Ravat of the Ethics Institute. Jovita served as the Executive Head of Ethics and Compliance at Vodacom Mozambique before joining MultiChoice as a Director for Regulatory Affairs. She has an LLB degree from the University of South Africa and an operational risk management qualification, and is a certified ethics officer. She's also a project associate for TEI and has extensive experience in the field of corporate governance, management of ethics and compliance programs. And Fatima is an associate of the Ethics Institute and a key part of the Gauteng Municipal Integrity Project, which focuses on supporting the Gauteng municipalities to enhance their integrity management capability. She has a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor of Law, and a Master's in Management of Local Governance and Development, and these are from the University of Witwatersrand. And she has certificates in legislative drafting and compliance management from the University of Johannesburg. She's an admitted attorney of the High Court of South Africa and a certified ethics officer with the Ethics Institute. She has extensive experience in working with and supporting public sector, both as an official and as a public sector management consultant, with a keen interest in governance, ethics and integrity management, anti-corruption, compliance and regulation. And as you can tell, both have extensive experience and a full understanding of the practicalities of making a code of ethics more than just a document which your organization has in a file, but something which becomes the heartbeat of the organization's value and daily operations. So I'm going to hand over now to Fatima to take us through the first session.
Great. Thank you, Barbara, and good morning, everyone. In our first session, we'd like to do a recap of what we covered in the session that we had earlier, so that we have a common basis in terms of our departure points. So in our first session, we had introduced the concept of ethics, and we said that in its most simplest form, ethics is about balance. It's about achieving a balance between doing what is good, what is right, what is fair, what is lawful, both for the self as well as for the other. And the self could be an individual, it could be the organization, and the other could be those that one interacts with. And we took that concept and we applied it to the notion of a code of ethics, and we said that in the context of organizations, a code of ethics can be considered to be a representation of what that good looks like, in terms of what is the balance that the organization tries to achieve, in terms of what is good for itself vis-a-vis what is good for others. We also introduced the concept of the ethics management framework. And in the ethics management framework, we've been through the notion of the framework as it finds ourselves. This framework was developed by the Ethics Institute. And in its simplest form, it says that what we want to do is impact on the ethical culture within our organization. And culture is the way we do things within our organizations. And how do we impact on culture? There are a couple of things that need to happen. So we need leadership commitment from all levels of leadership within our organizations. We need to have the appropriate governance structures in place to exercise oversight over are we building an ethical culture within our organization. And then we spent quite a bit of time looking at the heart of this framework, which sits in the center, which is about managing ethics. And we had a discussion around, if we were to manage ethics, where would you start? And you would start by firstly understanding what are those things in your organization that undermine your organization from being ethical, as well as what are those opportunities that you can leverage off, and we call that an ethics risk assessment. And once you've done that, you would then determine an ethics strategy. Where am I going to in terms of building an ethical organization, and an implementation plan, how I'm going to get there. And after that, that is where your code of ethics fits in. And we spent a lot of time talking about what is the code of ethics, and how does it link with your ethics policies. So maybe just to summarize, once you have your ethics strategy, you can then go off and determine, do I have something that represents or codifies or sets out what does good look like in my organization? If I have that, do I need to tweak it, or do I need to refine it so that it aligns with my strategy? If I don't have one, should I go off and develop or draft a new document, which I call a code of ethics, which is the constitution in terms of setting out what is the ethical conduct expected in my organization? And once I have that, then do I look at my policies, ethics related policies, and ensure alignment between my policies that I have in place and the code of ethics. So you will notice in the framework that it uses the terminology of code and policies, and that refers to the code of ethics as well as the ethics related policies. And that is a myriad of policies that relate to the way in which ethics is managed within your organization. And then summarizing on from there, once you've got your code of ethics and your policies intact and aligned, then do you, as the ethics custodian or the ethics office in your organization, go off and start to make ethics real within your organization. Because now you have a solid basis. You've understood the risk, you've developed a strategy, where am I going to go to? You've got an implementation plan, how am I going to get there? You've checked your code and policies, your regulatory universe is intact. You're now in a comfortable position to go off into your organization and start to do training, start to do awareness raising, start to run campaigns with that solid understanding in place. And then as the ethics office, you monitor what you do and you report back to your governance structures. And that's a constant process that as the ethics office that you would follow. So for the rest of our discussion, before we move on to drafting, it's important for us to understand where that codes of ethics fits into the broader framework. Now, when we get into drafting a code of ethics, the most fundamental question that we need to understand as those of us who are responsible for drafting, or those of us that are going to provide guidance to the drafting process or to the drafters. The critical question is, what is the purpose of the code of ethics? And I would strongly encourage you to write that down, to have it down, to put it down on a PowerPoint, to write it down on a piece of paper, because purpose, you're going to come back to this question all of the time. What is the purpose of the code of ethics? And that question is so critical to the design and the drafting of your code of ethics. And when we talk about the purpose of the code, what are we referring to? We're asking ourselves, and you as the custodian of that process need to ask yourself, what should this code do for the organization? What do I want it to achieve when I draft this code? What is the purpose of that code? And I cannot overemphasize how critically important purpose is. The answer to the question around purpose is to everything you do as the custodian of this process. And when you, in your mind's eye, sit down and you think about purpose, or you're in discussions with your colleagues who are going to be supporting this process, the fundamental question that you need to ask yourself to arrive at the answer around purpose is, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to curb negative ethics risks? Are we wanting to be punitive in what we're doing? And if that is what we want to do, then the mode in which we're going to develop this document is a compliance mode, because that mode is, this is what is expected. You shall comply with what is expected. However, if the mode in which you're going to be, or if the intention of doing your code of ethics is about building a strong ethical culture, which is essentially what we strongly advocate a code of ethics is in the ambit of the ethics management framework, then the mode in which you develop your document is an integrity mode. That means that I'm building this code of ethics on developing or drafting this code of ethics with the intention of contributing to building an ethical culture. And when I do that, the mindset and the approach in which I develop this document is determined strongly by the answer to that question. So this, before we get into the detail, that is the most fundamental question that we need to get into. Barbara, I'll stop here at this point.
Thank you very much. Javita, would you like to join us to provide the input into the practical side of this?
Yeah, so I think that first, good morning, everyone. And then following up on what Fatima was saying, I think that one of the things that we have to understand is when we are deciding to do a code of ethics, we have to have it very clear. What are the objectives that we want to achieve with this? And this comes from first identifying the stakeholders. What promises do we want to make to those stakeholders in terms of how we're going to act towards them? So your purpose revolves around that, revolves around your promises to your stakeholders, is meaning your employees, your clients, the community that you impact, your shareholders. So all of that comes into defining what is the purpose of your code of ethics, and also. That also is very important to have that in mind also when you're deciding exactly what approach you're going to have. Fatima well said that if you want to build a culture, you need to be inspiring. So you're not going to have a lot of rules, you're going to have more values because your objective is actually to inspire a change, transform the culture. So all of those things will define exactly how your code is going to look like. If it's just to regulate on conducts that you've identified that you want to curb and cut and sanction, then you will be more on an instructive type of code, your purpose will be more instructive, and you will define that you have rules and sanctions. If it is to develop the culture, then you have to have values. You have to have, your objectives need to be more of an aspiration that I want to be known as. This is what I want people to recognize in my company, in me, as a trait. So defining your purpose is very important, because even the language on your code will be defined by what your purpose is and where you want to go with the code. So I think those would be my 2 cents on this part.
Thank you very much, Javita. I'm able to take questions now if you have them, and while we wait for you to put your Q&A into the Q&A box, I just wanted to ask the two of you, is there a way in which the current or the status quo of the organization is actually impacts the way in which you define the purpose? Because I'm hearing here you've got this where you want compliance, and then there's another option where you want to actually achieve some sort of change of culture. How do you achieve that in defining a purpose of a code when an organization may sort of lean heavily towards the compliance aspect without allowing the values to be what drives the code?
Would you like, Javita, would you like to go first? Or would you like me to?
No, you can go, I'll go after.
Okay, thanks. So Barbara, I mean, I think this framework is very critical when answering your question. So when an organization embarks on an ethics journey, it's about indicating a commitment to want to be an ethical organization so as to be able to influence its ethical culture. And when you, in this process of ethics management, and the critical thing being understanding your risks. So it's almost like holding up a mirror. What are those things that undermine us being ethical, and what are those things that are opportunities we can leverage on? When you have that ethics risk profile and you embark on an ethics strategy process, your strategy is quite a defining moment for you as an organization, because it determines what are we going to focus on so as to address those risks and be the sort of ethical organization we want to be, and how are we going to also leverage off the opportunities. So when you're starting your code development process, you draw on the strategy as your guidance to what am I going to do with the code. Because your strategy is accompanied by an implementation plan. And it says, this is our vision. We want to be a sort of organization that is known to be an ethical organization that acts with integrity. How are we going to get there? We're going to make sure that we put out the policies and codes that are in line with that vision. So already that gives you the lead in terms of the type of organization that you want to be, and the type of code of ethics that you're going to set out. So that the kind of golden thread or link, but certainly from the eye of the ethics management framework, the link between the risk assessment process and the strategy process in terms of developing your code of ethics is very critical. Javita?
Yeah, and following up on that, Barbara, one of the things we have to remember, because we already on the process, we've done a risk assessment, we've engaged our stakeholders, we already know what the risks are. The aim of defining your purpose is actually also knowing that how you're going to design your code of ethics will depend on the time and the reality of your company at that moment. Because if you define a purpose that has nothing to do with the risks that you've been able to assess, then it's not going to respond. So your purpose actually can change. Like your final purpose will never change, but the way you implement it will change in time. And the fact that your code is reviewed regularly also helps you. You have your purpose, you know where you want to go, you know how to change it to get there through time. So knowing your purpose gives you a roadmap in terms of what you're drafting right now, what reviews you have to make from time to time, and what changes are necessary throughout throughout that timeline, in order for you to speak less of sanctions and rules and more of values. So this has to be a transitional process. So it's important to have a purpose at the beginning, because then you can kind of design your time frame and your road plan in terms of the change of your company and of your code as you go along.
Thanks very much. And I think what both of you have mentioned is that this is a process, that it is a developmental thing. It's not something we write and it's finished. And so I think that leads very nicely into the second part of our program, which is looking at the what and the how. In other words, what do we put into this code of ethics? What must it look like? How must it sound? What is the detail that's required? So over to you, Fatima, and then Javita, you can follow straight after or provide input as you go along.
Okay, great. So when we talked about purpose, we basically are saying, why are we doing this? And that question, the answer to purpose is so critical, because it, as Jovita has just said, it informs everything else that we do. And I strongly recommend that as you, the person in charge of this process or managing this process, whether you work on paper or whether you work on your computer or you work on a whiteboard, go off and start a checklist, a way that you almost have a column, or you have a table that and you start to populate this table with the answers to this question. So the first row on your table should be purpose. Why am I doing this? And even if you think about purpose and you write the words the way it comes to you, don't think about getting it perfect. Write it down and then go back and keep refining it. And as you engage, get to a point where you have clearly, intactly, succinctly summarized what that purpose is, and have it written down, because it becomes your guide for you as you are the drafter of this process. So once you have the answer to purpose, then the next thing that you need to determine is the design. Now, when we talk about design, basically we're talking about the how. So the question that you're asking yourself when you think about design is, you could have one of two situations. You could have a situation where you could have an existing code that your ethics risk assessment and strategy process may have pointed to say, there's some, we need to refine it or review it because it's out of sync with where we're at, or we don't have anything, we need to develop a new code. So you could have one of those two situations. And then once you determine what is your reality, the how question or the design question is, how are we going to get to the document? How are we either going to develop a new one, or how are we going to review what we have? And what your role then is to develop a plan that sets out what is the process that we're going to follow. And in the session that follows after this, Jovita and I will go into that in a little bit more detail. So I don't want to spend too much time on that now. But essentially just to say that purpose determines everything else. And once you've determined purpose, the next thing you need to determine then is the how. How am I going to get there? Then once you've got the answers to those questions, the next thing that you as the drafter of the process need to think about is the format. So what is it that I'm going to be putting into this code? And again, it comes back to purpose. So earlier when we talked about purpose, we talked about the mode in which you're going to draft. Why am I doing this? And what is the mode that I'm going to approach? Now we find that if you had to think of a spectrum, there are two ends of a spectrum. On the one end of the spectrum, you have more compliance-orientated documents. Those documents are known as directional codes. And in our first session, we spent a bit of time looking at the difference between a code of conduct and a code of ethics. So if you think about a code of conduct, traditionally, it is a very directional sort of document because it contains rules and it expects you to comply. So that sits on the one end. Now, the positive of having a document like that is generally it's quite specific. It has sanctions and it's enforceable. You can take it and use it in perhaps a disciplinary process, but a code of conduct tells you what to do. It doesn't leave room for you as an individual or as an employee to have discretion about how you make decisions. It says theft is theft. If you steal, this is the consequence. Now, that's on one end of a spectrum. If you had to think about it, it tells you exactly what needs to happen. Now, when we talk about codes of ethics, they traditionally set on the other end of the spectrum, which we refer to as aspirational documents. So a code of ethics is aspirational because it's, as Javita spoke about earlier, it emphasizes the values and the integrity of the organization. It's about contributing to building the ethical culture. And generally, a code of ethics, when you develop one, is intended to be a document that is short, that is easily recallable, and it also is not directional. It gives to the reader a sense that this is what we're about, but I'm not telling you what to do. The discretion about how you navigate the decision sits with you. A code of ethics sets out what does good look like, but it's not saying you shall. It leaves that discretion. But people often say that a negative or a downfall of a code of ethics is it tends to be vague and it tends to be not enforceable, because it really is about who we are and what we're about. But others could argue that that's exactly the intention of a code of ethics. The intention of a code of ethics is to be exactly that. It tends to be short, it tends to be recallable, and it's not intended to be a document that is enforceable. Now, what we're starting to see a lot about is many organizations are opting for some sort of integrated document, because they are finding that aspirational documents tend to get a lot of support and buy-in from within the organization. And what we're seeing is that organizations are, when they're developing their codes of ethics, incorporating issues around behavior within the code of ethics. So earlier we would see short and sharp code of ethics documents that are really only about values of integrity. Now we're starting to see a trend where you have combined documents that talk about values and integrity, but then use it as an opportunity to unpack the values through illustrated behaviors or accompanying behaviors, thereby also covering the issues around rules and compliance. So for you as a drafter, it's really important to ask yourself, what is the format of my document? Who is the audience for my document? Is there going to be coherence in what I'm going to write in my document? What am I going to do when I set this document out? And again, write that down. And we call this the kind of almost the architecture of your code of ethics. Ask yourself, where am I putting myself on the spectrum, and why? And again, the link between the purpose and the format are so critical. Now, when you think again, linked to your architecture is about the structure. How am I going to organize my information? How am I going to organize what I want to say within my document? And they're different models or different options. And again, this is where it's so important for you as the ethics officer, ethics custodian, to be so central to the process, because you know your context best. So some organizations find that what works best in terms of structure is to adopt a risk-based model. So a risk-based model is one where the drafters or the organization would identify their risks areas like they would have done from the risk assessment. They group that together and organize the information or the structure of the document around the risk. So the whole document in the code of ethics is structured around what are the key risks for the organization. So you could find perhaps in regulated industries, maybe like in the cellular phone industry or in the banking industry, they tend to adopt that sort of approach, and it's very much about the context. Then other organizations organizations opt for a more stakeholder model. So in those organizations, when they structure the document, they're all about their stakeholders. And so when they write the document, they want to bring that out. So they structure the document such that they write the provisions around their stakeholders. So if you want to Google, and it's a good thing as you draft to go out and to search the internet and to find examples of others in your industry. What are they doing, and get a feel for it for you as a drafter, so you can be creative in that process, but also have some ideas around what others are doing. So one example you could think of is, if you go look on the internet for the Johnson & Johnson Credo, that is one example of a code of ethics that is structured around a stakeholder model, where as a healthcare industry service provider, they have said our customers and our clients and healthcare comes first. We've organized who we are, what we say we are, around those stakeholders. Then you have other organizations that adopt a more values-based model, where they say, these are our values that we've identified, and we organize our document around our values. So again, knowing your context is so important, knowing your purpose is so important, and determining your structure is then critical. And structure, as I've mentioned, you need to make sure that it's clear, that it's understandable, and very important to that is knowing who is your audience. Who am I writing it for? Are they able to understand the document? Is it able to be clear and cover the content in a way that makes sense within your context? Then the next thing for you to think about when you draft your code is tone. Language is so important. The tone of the document is so critical, because we cannot deny the fact that people read between the lines. So you may write something in another way, but check yourself in terms of what is it and how is it sounding in terms of what you write. Because if you're going to write, and if you're adopting that compliance mode, you're more likely to, if you're in compliance mode, use the language of you shall not or you must not. It's inevitable that that would be the language that you would use, and the way that it sounds, or the way that people read between the lines, is around prohibition. It's negative. But when we use language and we are adopting ourselves in an integrity mode, and our purpose is to contribute to building ethical culture, and our format and structure follow, our tone is more about who we are, what are we about. So our language is softer. We aspire to, and that's more positive and supporting. So really think about, what am I doing? Why am I doing this document? What is the format? What is the structure? And then what is the tone I'm going to use? Because if you're adopting an integrity mode and you're wanting to build an ethical culture, but if your tone is going to be one about you must not, there's a misalignment between your purpose and your tone. So constantly you need to ask yourself, is what I'm doing checking back and aligning with the purpose of the document? Then once you've got all of that, think about the content of what you're writing. And in your content, it's really important that you draw that line from your ethics risk assessment and your strategy into your code of ethics. Why am I doing this? What are the key messaging that I want to have out? Who is my audience? Is it homogeneous? Is it clear? Is it simplistic enough for my audience to understand? And your writing style is also very important. So keep the language clear, keep the language simple. We say the simpler, the better. A code of ethics traditionally is short, it's sharp, it's easy to read. And if the context necessitates, translate into other languages so that it has wider applicability within your context. And also, for it to be palatable, think about how you package the document. So use graphic designs or artwork or etc., so that when people see it, they also experience it in a positive way. So think about all of these elements for you as a drafter of the code of ethics. Now, if you look at it can vary. The content of the code will vary from organization to organization. And I want to encourage you to be creative in this process as the drafters, because again, you know your context. But some of the key elements that traditionally one would cover in a code of ethics. And again, as we share this with you, I want to bring your attention back to the importance of the ethics management framework that we shared with you, because your leadership commitment is so important. Having your code start with a leadership message is critical, because it shows that it has leadership support and buy-in, and leadership is setting the tone. Having a critical link between your vision and your mission of your document, putting out your value statement, having some sort of examples around conduct revisions, and if you think it's appropriate in a way in your document, setting out what your sanctions are, then many organizations opt to also put out what are their supporting systems or resources. So if you're finding yourself challenged, who can you go to for ethics advice? Maybe putting a little block at the end to say, you can go here for advice if you're stuck, if you experience a dilemma, here's a link. So try to make it as user-friendly as possible. And some organizations, especially in highly regulated contexts or in corporates that work in like the banking industry, tend to also use it as an opportunity to sometimes have a text box or a link to say these may be other policies or legislation that might be relevant. But most smaller or medium-sized organizations tend to keep it shorter and opt not to bring in policies of legislation in place, but rather just keep it to the actual words around the context and the content of the document. Barbara, I'll stop there for Javita.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Javita.
Okay. Just trying to translate Fatima's very good presentation. I think that in terms of drafting codes of ethics, it's very important, as we said before, to have a purpose. I will talk about here because I know we have a lot of multinationals in the call, and probably a lot of you will be working for multinationals and probably will not be doing drafts from scratch. You'll get a company code of ethics that are for the whole group sometimes. And it's still important for you to look at the code of ethics and try to localize it. And when I say localize it, is not dismissing the values that are there or what was chosen, but to have an understanding of how they apply to your reality. So I bring that because I know that that's the reality for a lot of the professionals in big multinationals in Mozambique, that we already have something drafted and our job is mainly to implement it. But the implementation needs to follow also a bit of a redrafting, because we need to look at it and see if everything speaks, or the purpose that it was drafted for, it's still the same. Because if we just take it as it is, we may then fail that purpose, because there's different interpretations, there's different ways of seeing the values, the way it was drafted. So it's very important to have that in mind also. So when I talk here is to drafters, redrafters, and implementers in terms of a code that comes from any other country or any other person drafting it. So having that into account, I think that it's very important that we understand what the difference in terms of what we choose as a code of ethics, what are the difference, and what can one style of code of ethics and another kind of create, because that will define what we put in it and how we put it in it. It's very important that we know exactly what we want to achieve. It's very important that we know that if we want our code to be something that transforms the culture, it should be more like Fatima was saying, more turned into values, or maybe more inspirational and less of straight rules that tell exactly what people should do and how they should do it, and what are the sanctions if they don't do it that way. The risk with choosing a code that tells exactly what the rules are is that this may hamper a bit the innovation and creativity of people, because they will do exactly as they are instructed. The other models, like the inspirational and the value ones, are more inspirational. Exactly that. They have a way of giving people a bit more information in terms of helping them think creatively and being able to apply the values to different situations. So that's the other limitation of having an pure instructional code, is that whatever is not written then leaves a doubt. People don't know how to act. But on the same token, a fully inspirational one may leave people with an empty plate, because they may not be able to totally grasp it. Although on the other session, we will explain to you how to go about actually demystifying the code and having people understand it and apply to their day-to-day. So it's very important to look exactly at what model we want. If we want to address risks that are there, we can do it through our code of ethics, but we can also think that the code of ethics has policies that are aligned to it. And those policies can serve that purpose of addressing each risk. And we can frame the risks in different policies that go along with the code of ethics. Having said that, it's not wrong, and a lot of companies have decided to mix the two, have a bit of the inspirational part and have the rule-based. It works, and actually I think that most importantly for drafters, redrafters and implementers, it's important to learn how to make the connection between the two, the rule-based and the inspirational, which is being able to explain to people when we talk about them, when we communicate about them, how do these two things marry to one another? Why do we have a rule? What purpose on the code of ethics does the rule that we have to attend to a certain risk, how does it feel that purpose? How does it feel that value that we are upholding on our code of ethics? The other thing is language and tone. Again, for multinationals, it's very important that we look at the language that we use, because the same term has different meanings in different jurisdictions. So it's very important that we have that very well aligned and localized. And having said that, also, if you have different languages in one country, it's important that the people that participate on the drafting are the same that do any translations to the code of ethics, because we don't want to lose the purpose that we first established. So translations sometimes create this connection between what was intended, what was the purpose, and the final translation. So it's important that we're also part of that, and we understand that if we live in a country, or in Mozambique, for example, there's different languages, and we may want to have our codes in different languages. It's important that we participate on translations of the code. Lastly, one of the things that I want to leave here is that when we decide to draft, we know our purpose, we know what we want the message we want to convey. We need to be very sure if the message we want to convey is an order or a support system. And when I say support system, it's something that people can recollect, can know by heart, because they'll relate to the message. And when we talk about the models of codes, actually its experience shows that people are more able to remember codes that are more value-based and are more inspirational than rules. So if you want to create a support, you want your code to be a support system, you need to make it in a way that people will first buy into it, understand it, and be able to rationalize it in terms of being able to push from their own heads every time they face with a situation, in terms of what would my company want me to do? What are the values of my company? Does my company accept this type of behavior? So codes of ethics that are more inspirational have that power, have the power of being a document that people will need to refer to or go back to read less times, because it's something that when they understand it, they incorporate it, it becomes a bit of part of them if they buy into the message that you actually trying to transmit. Directive ones have a function, which is when we have certain risks that we need to really address, we need to tell people what are we doing about them, and what happens if people deviate from the behavior we want. Those are important, but at the end of the day, they are just that. People will learn what to do in that precise situation. And then when they're faced with some other situation, they may not be able to construe it from that rule into the new situation. So it's very important that we kind of balance both of the approaches, and we have clear view that we'll need to step into one into the other from time to time, but then having an inspirational one has the power of building people and actually building a culture and transforming the culture.
What I wanted to say was that the purpose of the Code of Ethics must address the difference between the company policies and procedures. And you touched on that, but in some ways, company policies and procedures can assist us in defining the Code of Ethics. Can you give us just some practical pointers of how that can happen?
So, I mean, essentially we say the Code of Ethics embodies, if I may use the word, it's overarching, it summarizes what we're about, what does good look like in our organization. But it is, as Javita's also mentioned, it is a short summarized document. You will then have a set of policies and procedures that will flesh out the way in which we do things in some more detail. So you would have a separate conflict of interest policies. We actually make a distinction between what we call core ethics related policies and then non-core ethics related policies. So your code of, your conflicts of interest, your gift policy, your extra remunerative work, your code of conduct, that contains the detail around what is expected, and you would not have that setting out in your code of ethics, because your code of ethics is meant to be exactly that, short and sharp and recallable, which is why when you noticed in the ethics management framework, it refers to code and policies, because it encourages a link between the code and the accompanying policies. And we strongly encourage ethics officers or ethics custodians to have a policy register in place that sets out what are the policies and its accompanying procedures in our document, in our organization, so we understand what that regulatory universe is like, but then we in a position to be able to connect the dots and be able to say, okay, this is how things link. So if we get asked for advice or we get asked for guidance, one needs to see a code of ethics as one of the tools in the broader picture or the broader tapestry of managing ethics within your organization. And just something else that Javita said that I wanted to pick up on is that your code of ethics is not going to give people the answer to an ethical dilemma. It's not going to say, if you find yourself into this situation, do this. It is going to tell them, this is what we're about. This is what the good looks like. So that when they face a dilemma, as Javita was talking about, they have the confidence or the know-how in terms of how to navigate that dilemma. And for you as the ethics officer, what you would do in addition to the code is you would advocate or teach people how to navigate ethical dilemmas. So one needs to really see the code of ethics as a component within the broader tapestry of other initiatives that you would be doing as the ethics officer to contribute towards building the ethical culture within your organization. I'll stop there, Barbara.
Excellent. Thanks, Javita. Have you got something to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the examples that Fatima gave was the Johnson & Johnson Credo. The Johnson & Johnson Credo is an amazing code of ethics, because they'll tell you exactly who they're making a promise to. So they start with each of their stakeholders, finishing with their shareholders, and they have a promise for their stakeholders. And this promise, when you read it and you are a Johnson & Johnson employee, I believe, when you know your credo is in each situation that you face with, and if you face with a situation with a customer, with a patient or anything, you know how to go back and say, this was the promise we made as Johnson & Johnson. So probably I shouldn't be shouting at this person. This is an example. Or if he's complaining of a medication, probably I should go back and kind of get to know what may have happened. So it's kind of like something easy to remember, something that you can pop to your head that will not give you the answer, but it will tell you that let me refrain and get more information, or maybe I shouldn't go over and above this line. And then procedures are very important, because on the day-to-day, you need to know when you have doubts in your job, where to look for further information. But the distinction I want to make is a code of ethics helps you when you don't have access to rules. Sometimes you can't go back and read the rules. So you need some guiding light, something that gives you that alert, that red flag that maybe I shouldn't be in this position, or maybe in this position, I'm supposed to remove myself because my company is going to support my decision because I know this is what we are. Because most of the times that's where a lot of mishaps happen, when people don't know what the company expects of them, and they only know that they told me to come back with a result. But nobody said, but you don't cross lines to come back with a result. So your code of ethics tells you that there are lines that we don't cross. So you know when you're faced with those that I'm not supposed to go over this to get the result.
Okay, thanks very much. I wanted to ask a question. Just say worst case scenario, you're in a multinational, there is a code of ethics, but nobody knows about it. They've never seen it. They just know it exists. There's the sort of value system in the organization is a little bit hazy, but you generally do the right thing. For the custodians of the code of ethics and the ethics work in the organization, how valuable, or what is the value of consulting staff in the process of, you know, I'm talking about a consultation process in getting staff to define some of that value system because of the importance of this balance or this integration between the one that is structured about what you do and don't do and the other one that is value-based. Would you like to answer that, Javita?
Yep, I can go. I think that one of the things that is very important is when you go about drafting a code of ethics, please bear in mind that it's not your code. It's a code to serve others. And being so, others need to be involved from the get-go. So if you're drafting a code of ethics, or in the case, unfortunately, of multinationals that come with code of ethics already drafted and designed in the way they should be, is to go through a process where you get the conversation going, where you measure people's acceptance, where you see what are people's expectations. So it's a process that needs to come from those that are going to be affected by it. So you do need to do your risk assessments. You do need to speak to people. You do need to have your forums, your discussions, your surveys, and all of that is what is going to feed you into what should be on your code of ethics. Because at the end of the day, your promises need to match the expectations. They're not going to match every time because we know they're like we humans, sometimes we have irrational expectations and sometimes it's not possible to attend to everyone's expectations. But the fact that I know that I was part of developing and I understand why maybe my expectation was not met, but somebody else's was, brings the buy-in. And this buy-in is very important. And that's what I was saying. When people can read a code of ethics, buy into it, see themselves in it, it's much easier to recollect it afterwards. And even if it's something that we never thought of, we get a code of ethics and we're like, oh, I didn't even know that this was wrong, whatever I was doing. The fact that I have the time to acknowledge why my behavior is affecting others wrongly is this process of rationalization, of involving people, is a very important process in drafting, adopting, and implementing a code of ethics or any type of policy as it is. Anything that affects people's lives, it's more impactful when they're involved in the search of a solution.
No, thank you for that. I'm going to follow this up with a question from David, who says, does the code of ethics include sanctions for wrongdoing, or the sanctions come only in the code of conduct? So between you and Fatima, you're welcome to address that before we go on to the next session.
Okay, I'll start. And then, I mean, we say that we make a very clear distinction between a code of ethics and a code of conduct. And the purpose of a code of conduct is really about setting out the rules and then the consequences of not abiding by the rules. So if you look at very big, highly regulated organizations, like perhaps typically the public sector, they would have a very clear distinction between a code of ethics and a code of conduct because of the large number or scale of organizations. So the code of conduct will say, this is the behavior. If you don't comply, this is the sanction. We take that into a disciplinary, we enforce it, and we use that process. And then separate from that, we have a code of ethics that really is about our values and what we're about and building up the ethical culture and integrity within our organization. So that is, in its strictest form, there is a clear distinction between the two because they serve two very different purposes. However, you are starting to find that many organizations are opting for a more hybrid model because they do find that we are able to tackle both as we mature on our ethics journey. And as we evolve and build our ethical culture, we're finding that we are becoming more impactful in terms of influencing behavior through the ambit of values. And are opting for documents that use the tone of code of ethics and illustrated behaviors, but don't contain sanctions. But are saying, when we talk about honesty or integrity, it means this. When we talk, it illustrates this. So it steers clearly away from the language of consequence, but it's building behavior through a proactive way. So yeah, Jovita, I don't know if you want to add there.
Yeah, that's an excellent
actually,
answer.
yeah, there's not much to add. I think you've covered it.
Okay. Well, thank you. Let's then plunge into session 3, where we look at the code design process and the key elements of that. So over to you, Fatima.
Okay, excellent. So I think we partly started to have this conversation around code design, because in code design, we're really talking about the how. So how are we going to get the document and how are we going to navigate this document in our context? So again, it's so important for you as the custodian of this process to understand what needs to happen in my context. What are the different, who are the stakeholders? What are the different levels of leadership that I need to go through to make sure that this document has buy-in through all levels? And Jovita's point around engagements with employees are also part of this process. So the design process, as I mentioned earlier, is about the how. And when you think about the design, almost put it as a layer over the ethics management framework that we shared with you earlier. So if you look at the Code of Ethics Handbook, which Barbara mentioned earlier, which you can access, it sets out the steps that you would follow, and it's set out in a diagram where you can say, okay, these are the steps, but I'm encouraging you to take it one step further and see those steps in terms of the elements of the ethics management framework. So first and foremost, you need leadership commitment, because that resonates with setting the tone at the top. And the closer you bring leadership to you, the easier it is for them to support the process from beginning to end. Then you need to understand what are your ethics risks and bring that process in to your organization, because your ethics risks are so critical to your content. Then you need a process of drafting, and you need to ask yourself this question: what is the plan for drafting within my organization? Who's going to do it? Are we going to have a drafting team? Who takes overall editorial responsibilities? How do we ensure alignment with our broader regulatory universe? Then what is the actual process? Are we going to have a first draft? Who are the stakeholders? What is the process of managing the stakeholders? Then what's going to happen in terms of getting the final draft? How are we going to finalize? And the better you get at having a plan, the easier it becomes for you to communicate that plan, but also to get others to be part of the process. Because the one thing that's important is that it's not an individual sitting in the corner that's doing this by themselves. A multilateral or multi-unit or a diverse group has a lot of merit in that process, because there is the different eyes, but overall you need someone that takes responsibility for tying it up. So have a plan that works in your organization in terms of how we're going to draft this document from beginning to end, and be able to share that plan. And once you have that, then the next step, once we've drafted it and we finalized it, you need to get approval. Again, you're going back to leadership commitment. Now, once it's sorted, you need to go off and get the document launched, because launching is important, because it's about how you take it out there. It's a milestone in this process of developing the code of ethics. So before you launch it, you need to make sure that it looks okay. And in this age of technology, you don't necessarily have to talk about always printing out documents. There could be other ways of doing it, but ensure that it looks good, that it's palatable to the eye, that it makes sense, that people are able to engage with it, and invest a little bit, if your company is able to, in publishing the code and having a milestone in launching the code, because it becomes an event, or something you can mark. We launched it on this date, so that if in any point in the future you go off and you review or you revise, you have a significant moment that you have appreciated in the history of your organization's ethics journey. Then the next thing would be to implement the code, but then to keep an eye on how things are going, so that you would be able to review and revise it. So that broadly speaks to what when we talk about code design or the how, it's about being able to tackle these different elements in terms of the how, but within each of those elements, having a plan in place in terms of how we're tackling that, with the end goal in mind, that what we want is a code of ethics that is going to be have buy-in within our organization, have the leadership support, so that it can achieve its intended purpose. I'll stop there, Barbara, for Javita to come in.
Okay.
Thanks, Tima.
Yeah. Okay, so I think Fatima has told you almost everything there is to say about it. But I think that one of the most important things is leadership commitment to this process is very important. Your top leadership needs to be part of the process. They need to acknowledge, accept, and be the promoters of this new code that's being drafted. And I say this because it's their behavior, first and foremost, that will have to be according to whatever is being drafted. If we're making a promise, they need to show that promise when it comes to implementation. So have that in mind, have leadership very clear on their role on this, this journey of a code of ethics. And also in terms of looking at what were the results and expectations that came out of your risk assessment. Like I said, the code serves people. People need to abide by it or need to understand it and embody it. So their concerns, their expectations need to be attended to. Their buy-in is very important. It shouldn't be a one-person exercise. Usually when it's a one-person exercise, then that one person needs to go around and advocate for it with everybody else, and it shouldn't be that way. So it should be a multi-team always working on it, because first, a multi-team gives you different perspectives of sometimes the same risk, because the same risk in a company is different in terms of how it affects different teams. And it's necessary to have this understanding when you're drafting any type of code, to understand how it affects different stakeholders, so that your language and what you write is able to cover all those people and have their buy-in. So it needs to be a multifaceted team that works on the drafting and the making happen of the code of ethics. And also, if you have that, there's always a lot of sensibilities that you will be collecting throughout the time, throughout the discussions, throughout the drafting and redrafting. So it's very important to have different sets of eyes, experiences, upbringings, anything that you can have as an added value is very important to have during this, this process. Once your code is then finalized, and this amazing team has managed to make this happen, leadership needs to approve it. My advice is that the first people to be trained on your code of ethics need to be your leadership, because they're the ones who need to now start living all these values or principles that you've now codified. So they are the caretakers of the code. There's an ethics department, there's an ethics officer. The ethics officer is there more to monitor, give support to management, but it's their duty now to say, this is our constitution, this is who we are. So you need them on board all the time. You need their approval. One of the things that Fatima said in terms of launching and making it an event is very important, because people also remember moments. It's not only because you can refer back to that, is that people remember moments and they associate important things with the moment that anything stops for that thing. So if you want your code of ethics to be regarded as something very important in your company, have an event. Launch it the way a launch should be. Make people stop and realize that we're actually putting effort into this. It's important for us. It's something to be remembered. It's something to be used. It's part of who we are from now on. So that is very important. And also keep in mind that although we've done a risk assessment, we involve stakeholders, we collect the sensibilities, this is a live document, as well as our company. Companies change. And we know by history that a lot of companies have been big, and then they've disappeared because they didn't innovate, they didn't change, they weren't able to listen to the market and be able to adapt as quickly. This is the rule for your code of ethics. It needs to adapt, it needs to innovate, it needs to change with the changes of your environment, of your company, of your employees. So it needs to be a live document. It needs to be something that you're always working on. You as a company in general are always working on, and always very aware of the new risks that come in, that need to be attended to. The ideal is that as a code of ethics is inspirational, there's not a lot of changes that you'll do, but there may be some tweaks that are necessary, because what we want is a holistic document that is actually something that lives through the years and is able to accompany the growth of the company. But it's not something that stays in a corner and we never change it because we think that it's now so holistic that it doesn't need any more working on. So those are my 3 cents now on it.
Barbara, your microphone.
Barbara, yeah.
Apologies. Thank you so much, Javita, and some very valuable inputs there from both of you. And I think so often what's useful is to have a process that we can follow and tick off the list. But in a sort of developmental kind of thing, like a code of ethics, that is something that is a luxury in a way, although they are the basics. Each company's, what shall we say, their culture is so different. And yeah, some valuable pointers though. I just want to ask a question. What do you do with leadership that is perhaps not on the same page as you, where you really are in a bit of a tussle around getting ethics into the mainstream?
Fatim, right? Okay.
Go ahead.
It's actually very pertinent question. I was asked that question yesterday when I was doing a training, and one of the things is, and this is reality. A lot of times you will not get into a boardroom and have everybody saying, "We were just waiting for you. We were just." It's a waste of time, and you'll probably have one person that says, "Oh, I see the value in it." This is the person you need to hang on to. If it's an ASCO member, grab this person and have them as your ambassador, because this is the person that is now going to take ethics into ASCO discussions. This is the person that is now going to make it part of ASCO discussions and will conquer others, because out of those people that will be there, some will just be, will just not have strong feelings to one side or another, or they will be people that actually believe that ethics is important, but never found a way to put it through. So this is my feeling is, if you find an ASCO that everybody does not want ethics, you have a big problem. But most of the times there'll be one or two people that understand the value of it, and these are the people that you need to now conquer, and they will be your ethics champion at ASCO level. And these are the people that are going to take the message and conquer the others.
Excellent. Fatima, have you got anything to add on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. 100% with Jovita, but you know, in the work that we do, a leadership commitment is so critical. So if the appetite is not right, we often first spend time investing in engagements with leadership. So we would, before embarking on an ethics journey, first, engage with the board, talk about what does ethical leadership look like? What does the governance of ethics look like? What needs to be placed? Frankly, have the conversation about, what is the consequences of not being ethical? What does it mean to be ethical? Because sometimes we tend to be concerned on the money and not about the reputational risk or what does it mean to be an ethical. So have those conversations, quite frankly, because as Javita is saying, not everyone would be of the same mindset. So we would spend time talking at board level, separate from EXCO level, having those conversations, talking about ethical leadership. What does it mean? What does it need? What does leadership commitment require? And get an express commitment from leadership to be for the organization to embark on an ethics journey. Because we say, it's about the tone at the top, but it also influences the mood in the middle and the groundswell at the bottom. So it is about getting that commitment first. And it also then, we talk about the need for there to be an ethics champion designated. So that would be someone who would be sitting at EXCO level, who would play the role that Javita is talking about. But you want to arrive at that decision or be able to open the door for the decision. Often you can't get the decision, but you want to start opening the doors or creating the awareness and then leaving for the, make the ground fertile for the conversation to happen, basically. And also in that conversation, emphasize the next block of the ethics management framework, which is about the oversight. Having an appropriate governance structure that exercises that oversight, because not all boards could have a social and ethics committee in place or a designated committee. So you want to have those conversations if it's an environment that's not ready. You know, you might find different environments. So where are you on that spectrum? You could find perhaps we want to be ethical, but we don't know what it means. Or perhaps we're pushing back. So it's useful to first understand where on that spectrum leadership sits, who makes up leadership. Are we talking board, exco? And then how do we work with each of them first, investing the time to, and then embarking on the journey itself, so
Right.
that it becomes a productive process.
Right. So Tanya, I think that might have covered your comment pretty well as well, where you've said that how do you get that leadership involved in the process? David, you have asked a question that we will answer in our next session. You've said, what would be the right and proper audience or target group for launching and selling the Code of Ethics? And our January topic is exactly that. How do you get this into the organization's DNA? And again, remember that it is a process. It's not just a once-off event. We've got a little bit of time, so if there are any questions, please be quick and put them on. But in the interim, what I'm going to do is just to provide you again with the email. I just want to share this, the email and website address, which is also in the chat. If you could just please go there. To find the handbook as well. So our email address is coimozambique@gmail.com, and the website is www.coi.org.mz. Then our masterclass, the last of the series, the series 1 on implementing or codes of ethics, is session 3, which is the nuts and bolts of implementation. What we're going to deal with is introducing this to the organization, how to implement it effectively, and then to measure how well you've done this process in the review. How do you conduct these very important steps in your code of ethics? We will be sending out, again, some information on that before the end of the week. And for those of you who know of organizations that would get some value from this, we would really appreciate you passing it on. At the moment, we are really trying to get as many multinationals and big Mozambican companies involved. And at this stage, what I'm going to do is to just give you a little bit of insight into the Coalition for Organizational Integrity in Mozambique. The focus is essentially on multinationals because of the impact and the investment that these organizations make in countries where development is so important. And we know from our experience in Mozambique that from oil and gas through to transport and mining and all of those big industries, from shipping, container terminals, all of these things are run by multinationals who invest massive amounts of money in these countries. And what we provide in the coalition is excellent support, as you've seen through these masterclasses, practical support to grow the integrity value of your organization. Part of what we're doing at the moment with certain of our organizations who've signed up, and I hope they don't mind if we mention them, is Manika, for example, and one of the banking companies that have taken up the offer which the coalition provides to assess their ethical culture in their organizations. And we've seen some really good information coming from those. And if you join the coalition, not as a member, but as a partner, there's no money involved, you are able to access this support where you can, and then further on in the process of the 5-year project, you will be able to have assistance in reviewing the ethical integrity and maturity of your organization. And these are very valuable tools that really just strengthen your position as the ethics officer or as the custodian of ethics. So if you have any questions with regard to organizations wanting to join, please, again, I provide you with the email, and if you can just drop us a line and we can get in touch with you. If there are any closing statements, Fatima and Javita, we'll just give you 2 minutes just to provide a sort of pointer for people. They've got this information, now what?
Shall I go first?
Yes.
Okay, I guess for me, it's a word of encouragement to say there's no one size fits all approach. You know, we give you the tools, go out there, and have fun drafting the process. If you are a certified ethics officer, you have the content, the context, the tools in which to do it. If you're not, go off and try to build up that skill, and look for other examples of how you can do it. Play with it a little bit and get a real feel for it, because that gives you a good idea of how to go about, and then test it with your drafting team. So as Javita was saying, there's so much value in having a multidisciplinary team within your group. So don't see it as your individual responsibility. Really try to be creative in the process and come up with something that works within your organization. So on that, I just want to wish everyone luck and all the best for the festive season. Thanks for the opportunity, Barbara.
Thank you, Fatima. Javita?
Okay. Yeah, from my side, I think Fatima said everything. One of the things is there's a bit of a habit of taking off the internet. Don't do it because there's a not one size fits all code of ethics, code of conduct. You want it to be effective, because there are bad consequences to ill-drafted code of ethics, code of conduct. You could have exactly the opposite reaction and consequences from what you wanted. So make it a process of your company. It's very important that it's bought in by those that it's going to affect. So that's my repetition. Actually, I'm repeating myself, but I think it's the most important part of it. Make it a process, your company's process, involve those that are going to be affected. It's key. Even if it's not perfect at the end, people understand where it's coming from and understand its purpose. And that is a gain on its own, because then people are able to adapt it to what it should serve.
Thank you. I'm just going to sneak a quick question in here from a participant from Mauritius, who wants to know if there is a relation between ethical conduct of an employee and his health in the organization. I'm not sure if that's metaphorical health or actual physical health.
We do find when we do ethics risk assessments, quite commonly, I'm tackling it in 2 ways. The first thing that we find quite commonly is if people are disinvested in the organization, alienated, demoralized, you know, that sort of thing, there is a greater likelihood of what we would see as counterproductive behavior or unethical behavior. So you would find people who may physically be at work but are not productive in the way in which. So there is that link that happens. And when we talk about culture, we talk a lot about ethical awareness, about people management issues, about the how of the, because we want to understand those things because of the link between the two. So we do see that coming up a lot. And a lot of what we also try to understand is then levels of ethical awareness within the organization as well as culture, because you can see that link between the two. And in that basket of counterproductive employee behavior, you would have high residence of things like absenteeism or abuse of sick leave or abuse of resources, etc. So just from a quantitative data point of view, there's a definite link between that. I'll hand over to Javita to add.
Running the risk of not answering the question because it's really not clear. I think that there's definitely a clear link between also job satisfaction in terms of being in an environment that helps me to be mentally healthy. And mental health is very important. And I think on this last year has been a big conversation, which we have to acknowledge that people, if they are unhappy at what they do and they have some kind of mental pressures and stress at work that they're not able to address, maybe because the culture is not the right culture, people are not listened to, there's harassment and all of that, that can actually cause physical ailments that are not explained by a doctor because they are basically products of a mental health problem. So yes, ethical conduct and a bad culture, a bad environment at work can lead to health problems.
Mm. No, thank you very much for that. And with that, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to you, Fatima, and to you, Javita, for presenting some really, really excellent work today. And I've learned so much, even though I'm ethically supposed to be certified. I actually learned so much in terms of the process, and very helpful to me, and I'm sure to our participants as well. So what's left then is just to say, have a really happy, safe, festive season, wear your masks, be careful, we're not out of the woods yet, and let's just hope that next year we can say goodbye to this virus and start to meet each other and carry on the good work. But in the interim, we hope we will see you all on the 21st of January.